The morning of March 18, 1945, dawned cold and gray over Lüneburg Heath in northern Germany. Frost clung to the wings of 64 Messerschmitt Bf 109s lined up in neat rows at Jagdgeschwader 27's forward airfield near Stendal. The engines were silent. Ground crews moved between aircraft with methodical efficiency, refueling, rearming, preparing for the day's operations. The war had ground on for nearly 6 years. Germany was losing, everyone knew it, but the Luftwaffe still had teeth. Jagdgeschwader 27 was one of them. A veteran fighter wing with kills stretching back to the Battle of Britain, they'd been pulled back from the Eastern Front to defend the Reich itself. Their mission that morning was straightforward. Intercept the American bomber stream expected over Brunswick and Magdeburg. Shoot down as many B-17s as possible. Make the Americans pay for every mile they flew over German soil. The Messerschmitts would be airborne by 0900 hours. They would never get the chance. 40 miles to the west, 2nd Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Howard was in trouble. His P-51 Mustang, tail number 413521, nicknamed Kentucky Belle, had taken flak damage during a bomber escort mission over Bremen. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to matter. A piece of shrapnel had punctured his coolant system. Glycol was streaming from the engine cowling, leaving a thin white trail in the frozen air. His cylinder head temperature was climbing into the red. He had maybe 15 minutes before the engine seized completely. His wingman, Lieutenant Charlie Morrison, flew formation off his right side. Charlie's aircraft was in even worse shape, 2 20mm cannon holes through the left wing, one through the tail assembly. They'd been jumped by a pair of FW-190s near Bremen and barely fought them off. Red leader, this is Red 2. I'm reading 190 on the temp gauge. We need to head west. Now. Roger that, Red 2. Setting course 270. Let's get home. Jimmy banked the Mustang westward, toward the Allied lines, toward safety. The mission was over. They'd done their job. Stayed with the bombers, fought off the interceptors, brought everyone home. Well, almost everyone. They'd lost Red 3 over Osnabrück. Billy Patterson from Toledo, 22 years old, engaged to a girl named Susan. His P-51 had spiraled down trailing smoke and fire. No parachute. No radio call. Just gone. That was the 8th pilot Jimmy had watched die in 3 months. He checked his fuel gauge. 200 gallons remaining. Enough to make it back to Debden with maybe 30 gallons to spare if the headwind didn't pick up. His engine temperature continued to climb. 205 degrees. 210. The Merlin engine in the P-51 could handle punishment, but there were limits. Then the clouds broke. For perhaps 5 seconds, the overcast parted. A gap in the weather maybe 2 miles across. Jimmy glanced down out of pure habit, scanning the ground below for landmarks, for flak positions, for anything worth noting in the intelligence debrief. What he saw made him forget all about his engine temperature. An airfield, a major one, and it was crowded. Dozens of fighters sat on the hardstands, dark shapes against the pale concrete, arranged in precise rows. Jimmy could see fuel trucks moving between them, ground crews working on engines. The morning servicing routine completely exposed, completely vulnerable. He'd flown enough reconnaissance to know what he was looking at. A forward fighter base, probably housing an entire Jagdstaffel, preparing for morning operations. Those fighters would be airborne within the hour. They'd be vectored toward the bomber stream. They'd engage the B-17s over their targets, shoot down bombers, kill crews. Men Jimmy knew. Men he'd escorted. Men who trusted the fighters to keep them alive. The clouds closed again. The airfield disappeared. Red lead. Did you see that? Charlie's voice had an edge to it. I saw it. That was Stendal. Has to be. Intelligence said JG-27 relocated there last week. I know. Silence on the radio for a moment. Then, Jimmy, we can't. You know we can't. We're in no shape for this. Jimmy said nothing. His hand was already on the throttle, pushing it forward. His mind already calculating distances, angles, approach vectors. The fuel. The engine temperature. The odds. The odds were terrible. One aircraft against an entire airfield. Against flak guns. Against whatever fighters might already be warming up their engines. Against the simple mathematics of ammunition. He had maybe 20 seconds of firing time left before his guns ran dry. But those bombers. The men in those bombers. Charlie, head for home. That's an order. Jimmy. That's an order, Lieutenant. You're too shot up for this. Get back to Debden. Tell them what we saw. And what are you going to do? Jimmy rolled the Mustang inverted and pulled the stick back, diving through the clouds toward the airfield below. Something stupid, he said. The dive through the cloud deck was blind. Jimmy flew on instruments, watching the altimeter unwind. 8,000 feet. 7,500, 7,000. Keeping the Mustang's nose pointed down at a 40-degree angle. The engine howled. The airframe shuddered. His airspeed climbed past 350 miles per hour. At 4,000 feet, he broke through the bottom of the clouds. The airfield spread out below him like a tactical map. He could see everything now. The main runway, the taxiways, the hard stands with their neatly parked aircraft. Hangars on the northern perimeter. Operations buildings. Fuel storage tanks. And the fighters, so many fighters. Messerschmitts, mostly, with a few Focke-Wulfs mixed in. Some had ground crews working on them. Others sat empty, waiting for their pilots. Jimmy had perhaps 10 seconds before someone on the ground noticed him. He used those seconds to plan his attack. The fuel trucks. That was the key. He could see them for vehicles moving between the aircraft, probably topping off tanks for the morning mission. If he could hit those, the resulting fires would do more damage than his guns alone ever could. He leveled off at 1,500 feet and pushed the throttle to war emergency power. The engine temperature gauge was deep in the red now, but it didn't matter anymore. He'd need power for maybe 2 minutes. After that, either he'd be dead or the engine would be, and in either case the temperature wouldn't be his problem. At 1,000 feet, someone on the ground finally saw him. The flak started at 800 feet. Light stuff, initially rifle caliber tracers arcing up from the perimeter, ground crews firing whatever they had to hand. Then the 20mm positions opened up. Orange tracers, much thicker, much faster, creating a lattice of fire in front of him. Jimmy flew straight through it. At 400 yards, he armed his guns. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, 1,880 rounds of ammunition remaining. Enough for about 17 seconds of continuous fire. He'd need to make every second count. At 300 yards, he selected his first target. A fuel truck positioned between 2 Messerschmitts, a ground crewman standing on top, probably working the pump handle. Jimmy put the gunsight pipper on the truck's cab and squeezed the trigger. The P-51 shuddered as all 6 guns fired. Tracers reached out across the distance, walking up from the tarmac to the truck in a line of impacts. The .50 caliber rounds, armor-piercing incendiary, 1 in every 5, punched through the truck's thin metal like paper. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the truck detonated. Aviation fuel doesn't explode like gasoline. It's more stable, harder to ignite. But under the right conditions, when atomized and mixed with air and hit with incendiary rounds, it can create a fireball that defies belief. This was one of those times. The explosion was orange and white, a sphere of fire that expanded outward with shocking speed. The ground crewman on top of the truck simply vanished. The 2 Messerschmitts bracketing the truck were engulfed immediately. their fuel tanks rupturing from the heat, adding their own flames to the conflagration. Jimmy was already pulling up and banking left. His airspeed was 380 now, way too fast to pull tight turns, but he didn't have a choice. The flak was getting heavier. A 37mm shell burst 50 feet off his right wing, close enough that the shockwave buffeted the aircraft. He spotted his next target, another fuel truck, this one farther down the flight line, moving away from the chaos. Jimmy rolled wings level for a 2-second burst. His tracers found the truck's tank. Another fireball erupted, smaller this time but still spectacular, catching one Messerschmitt and badly damaging 2 others. Then he was past the airfield, screaming over the perimeter at 50 feet, trees flashing by below his wings. He hauled back on the stick and climbed, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces. Behind him, Stendal Airfield was burning. But he wasn't done. Charlie's voice burst through the radio, frantic. "Jimmy! Jimmy! Get out of there! The whole field's awake. They'll tear you apart." "One more pass," Jimmy said. His voice was calmer than he felt. "I can get the fuel depot." "You're out of your mind." "Probably." He'd seen it on the first pass, the main fuel storage facility, on the eastern side of the field. A cluster of above-ground tanks, probably holding tens of thousands of gallons. Underground pipes fed fuel to pumping stations scattered across the hardstands. If he could ignite those tanks, the chain reaction would devastate the entire facility. Big if. Jimmy rolled into his turn, lining up for his final approach. The fuel gauge read 140 gallons. His engine temperature was so high the needle had pegged against the stop. White smoke was streaming from the cowling now, coolant boiling off, mixing with oil vapor. The engine could quit at any second. The flak was much heavier this time. The Germans knew he was coming back. Every gun on the field was trained skyward, waiting for him. 37mm, 20mm, even a few 88mm batteries from the nearby flak tower. The sky ahead looked solid with bursting shells. Jimmy dove into it anyway. At 500 feet he was hit for the first time. A 20mm shell punched through his left wing, just outboard of the gun bays. The wing bucked upward. The Mustang yawed left. Jimmy kicked right rudder and fought to keep the nose straight. At 300 feet he was hit again, this time in the tail. He heard the impact, a sharp metallic bang, and felt the control stick go mushy. The elevator was damaged. At 200 feet he lined up on the fuel depot and fired. His remaining ammunition, maybe 8 seconds worth, poured into the tank farm. 50 caliber rounds walked across the tanks, punching holes, creating sprays of aviation fuel that misted into the air. For 3 long seconds, Jimmy thought he'd failed. The tanks leaked but didn't ignite. He was already past them, pulling up, when he saw a flash in his mirrors. Then the world turned white. The first tank didn't just explode. It detonated. When one fuel tank went up, it set off the tank next to it. Then the next. Then the next. The entire fuel depot went up in a cascading chain reaction that took less than 2 seconds from start to finish. The fireball rose into the morning sky, a pillar of orange and black that mushroomed at the top. The shockwave radiated outward in all directions, flattening small buildings, shattering windows, sending ground personnel tumbling. Underground fuel lines ruptured. Burning aviation fuel sprayed from broken pipes, creating dozens of secondary fires across the airfield. Pumping stations exploded. Hardstands became lakes of fire. Messerschmitts that had survived the initial attack were now engulfed in flames as burning fuel spread beneath them. Jimmy Howard felt the blast wave hit his Mustang like a physical blow, a massive hand shoving his aircraft upward and sideways. The P-51 was thrown into an uncontrolled climb, engine screaming, airframe groaning. His instruments spun wildly. The artificial horizon tumbled. The airspeed indicator needle swung erratically. He fought the controls, fought to regain some kind of stability. The stick was barely responding. Whatever damage the tail had taken was worse than he thought. The Mustang wallowed through the air. And then the engine quit. Not slowly. Not with warning. Just silence. The propeller windmilled for a few seconds, then stopped, locked in place by a seized piston. The sudden quiet was surreal, broken only by the whistle of wind through bullet holes and the distant sound of explosions behind him. Jimmy was at 3,000 feet, 30 miles behind enemy lines in a dead aircraft. He looked back over his shoulder. Stendal Airfield was chaos. The entire southern half of the base was burning. Smoke rose in thick black columns that merged into a single pillar visible for miles. He could see aircraft burning on the hardstands, buildings collapsed, the runway cratered and unusable. "Not bad," he said aloud, to no one in particular. "Not bad for a Tuesday." Then he started looking for a place to land. A dead-stick landing in a fighter aircraft is one of aviation's more challenging maneuvers. Without engine power, you have no second chances. You glide in, you pick your spot, and you commit. If you misjudge the approach, you crash. If you overshoot, you crash. If you undershoot, you crash. The margins are measured in feet and seconds. Jimmy had practiced forced landings in training. Every fighter pilot had. But practicing over a friendly airfield in Texas was very different from the reality of gliding over occupied territory with a damaged aircraft and hostile forces below. He looked for options. The terrain below was a patchwork of fields and forests, roads and small villages. He needed something flat, something long, something without trees or ditches or stone walls. He had maybe 3 minutes of gliding time left before he'd be too low to choose. There, a farmer's field, maybe half a mile long. Recently plowed but not yet planted. Not ideal but better than the alternatives. He could see a farmhouse at one end, a barn at the other. Empty otherwise. Jimmy turned toward it, bleeding off altitude. He'd need to time this perfectly. The Mustang was heavier without engine power. No prop wash over the control surfaces meant mushier handling, slower response. And with the elevator damage, he'd need to use trim and throttle, except he didn't have throttle anymore. 1,500 feet. He was coming in too high and too fast. He deployed the landing gear, the hydraulic system still had pressure, and felt the drag increase. The Mustang slowed, sank faster. 1,000 feet. Better. He was lined up on the field, drifting slightly left. He corrected with rudder, felt the damaged tail protest with a shudder that ran through the entire airframe. 500 feet. The field was coming up fast. He could see individual furrows now, the dark turned earth, the frost still clinging to the shadowed hollows. A man emerged from the farmhouse, staring up at him. 200 feet. Jimmy lowered the flaps. The Mustang's nose pitched down. He pulled back on the stick, flared, felt the tail drop. The P-51D hit the ground hard. The main gear touched first, then the tail wheel. Jimmy bounced, came down again, bounced a second time. The right main gear collapsed with a tortured shriek of metal. The wing dropped, dug into the soft earth. The Mustang spun 90 degrees in a spray of mud and turf before sliding sideways for another 100 feet. Then it stopped. Jimmy sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the controls, unable to quite believe he was alive. His hands were shaking. His ears were ringing. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cold. He was alive. He popped the canopy. It stuck, damaged in the landing, and he had to shoulder it open and climbed out onto the wing. His legs were unsteady. The left one buckled and he sat down hard on the wing root, breathing hard. The farmer was running toward him across the field, shouting something in Dutch. Behind him, others were emerging from the farmhouse. A woman, children, an older man with a hunting rifle. Jimmy raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. "American," he called out. "U.S. Army Air Forces. Friendly. American." The farmer reached him, breathing hard, and said something rapid in Dutch. Jimmy shook his head. The farmer tried again, slower, mixing in German words. Still nothing. Finally, he tried broken English. "You, American? Truly?" "Truly," Jimmy said. He pulled off his leather glove and pointed to the flag patch on his jacket. "United States Army Air Forces." The farmer's face split into an enormous grin. He turned and shouted something to the others. The woman dropped what she was carrying and began to cry. The children whooped and ran closer. The farmer grabbed Jimmy's hand and shook it vigorously. "Welcome," he said in English. "Welcome. You are safe here. We help. Come, come." Jimmy let himself be helped off the wing. His legs were steadier now, though his left knee hurt, probably twisted it in the landing. The farmer supported his weight and led him toward the farmhouse. "We saw," the farmer said, pointing east. "We saw the explosion. Very big fire." He looked at Jimmy with something like awe. "You do this? You alone?" Jimmy looked back at his wrecked Mustang, at the smoking engine, at the bullet holes and shrapnel tears, at the collapsed gear and bent propeller. Kentucky Belle would never fly again. She'd brought him home one last time. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did that." The farmer clapped him on the shoulder. "Then you are hero. Come. We hide you. The British, they are close. Maybe 10 kilometers. We get you to them." Jimmy Howard spent 6 hours in the farmhouse. The farmer's name was Henrik, before British forces arrived. A forward reconnaissance unit, moving ahead of the main lines, had been vectored toward the area after reports of massive smoke columns from Stendal. The British lieutenant who took charge was skeptical. "So let me understand this correctly. You claim to have attacked Stendal airfield single-handedly? Destroyed how many aircraft?" "I didn't count," Jimmy said. "Maybe 40? 50? Hard to say with all the fires and secondary explosions. 50 aircraft. Single-handedly. Right. I hit the fuel depot. That's what did most of the damage. The fuel spread across the hardstands, set off ammunition in the aircraft, created a chain reaction. I just lit the match." They made the journey in a jeep, bouncing over rough roads toward the Allied lines. The British troops were in good spirits. They could smell victory in the air, knew the war was entering its final weeks. They reached Allied lines just after 1600 hours. Word had already spread. By the time Jimmy's jeep rolled into the forward headquarters, there was a small crowd waiting. Colonel Matthews, Jimmy's commanding officer, pushed through to the jeep. "Howard! Christ, we thought you were dead. Charlie Morrison came back 3 hours ago babbling about you going on some kind of suicide run." He stopped, looking Jimmy up and down. "You're not hurt?" "No, sir. Aircraft's wrecked, but I walked away clean." "Where the hell did you land?" "Farm field, about 30 miles east of here. Dutch farmer hid me until the British showed up." Matthews stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Lieutenant, you're either the luckiest son of a bitch in the 8th Air Force or the craziest. I haven't decided which." "Both, probably, sir." That got a laugh from the assembled crowd. Matthews' expression softened slightly. "All right, get yourself checked by the medics, then report to intelligence for debriefing. They'll want every detail you can remember." The debriefing lasted 2 hours. 3 intelligence officers grilled Jimmy about every aspect of the attack: approach vector, altitude, aircraft types observed, damage assessment, flak positions, everything. They made him draw diagrams, estimate distances, describe the fuel depot layout. Finally, one of them, a captain with wire-rimmed glasses, sat back and said, "Well, Lieutenant, if even half of what you're telling us is accurate, you've just pulled off one of the most effective single aircraft strikes of the entire war." "I just followed my training, sir." "Your training doesn't cover attacking an entire airfield alone." "No, sir. That part one made up as I went." Reconnaissance photos came in the next morning. An RAF Mosquito had overflown Stendal at first light, cameras running. The photos were spread out on a table in the operations hut when Jimmy arrived. The airfield was devastated. The entire southern half was a blackened ruin. Twisted wreckage dotted the hardstands, burned out hulks that had once been Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The fuel depot was simply gone, replaced by a massive crater surrounded by scorched earth. The main runway was cratered in 3 places and covered in debris. The hangars were collapsed. The intelligence officer traced his finger across one of the photos. "We count 47 aircraft destroyed outright. Another 17 damaged beyond repair. That's 64 aircraft that will never fly again. Plus fuel stores, ammunition, maintenance facilities." He looked up at Jimmy. "JG-27 is effectively finished as a combat unit. They don't have the time or resources to rebuild before the war ends." Jimmy studied the photos in silence. Somewhere in all that wreckage were men who'd died yesterday morning. Men who'd been eating breakfast, drinking coffee, writing letters home. He'd killed them. It had been necessary. He knew that. Those fighters would have shot down bombers, killed American and British crews. By destroying 64 aircraft on the ground, he'd saved the lives of dozens, maybe hundreds of Allied airmen. But that didn't make it easy to look at. "Well done, Lieutenant," the intelligence officer said. "Truly exceptional work." "Thank you, sir." The Distinguished Flying Cross arrived 6 weeks later, forwarded through channels with unusual speed. General Doolittle himself signed the citation. They pinned the medal on him at a ceremony at Debden in late April. Most of the squadron attended, along with officers from wing and group headquarters. Charlie Morrison stood beside him, grinning. After the ceremony, the pilots threw a party in the officers' club that lasted until 0300 hours. The war ended 3 weeks later. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Jimmy was in London when he heard the news, on a 3-day pass, sitting in a pub with some British pilots who'd become friends. The entire city exploded in celebration. People poured into the streets, dancing, singing, crying with relief and joy. Jimmy sat at the bar, nursing a pint, and thought about all the people who weren't there to celebrate. Billy Patterson from Toledo, Red 3 who died over Osnabrück. All the others, hundreds of pilots from his squadron alone. The British pilot next to him, a flight lieutenant named Davies, noticed his expression. "Not celebrating, Yank?" "I'm celebrating," Jimmy said. "Just thinking about the ones who didn't make it." Davies nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know what you mean." He raised his glass. "To absent friends." "To absent friends," Jimmy echoed, and they drank. Jimmy Howard returned to the United States in July 1945. He was discharged from the Army Air Forces in September with the rank of captain. He'd been promoted twice in the final months of the war. He went home to Kentucky to a small town outside Louisville. They threw him a parade. The whole town turned out. The high school band played. The mayor gave a speech about heroism and sacrifice. Jimmy stood on a platform in the town square, wearing his dress uniform with the DFC on his chest, and smiled and waved. After the parade, after the speeches, after the cake and the handshakes and the endless photographs, he walked home with his parents. His mother linked her arm through his and said, "We're so proud of you, Jimmy." "Thanks, Mom. What you did over there, that thing with the airfield, They say you saved hundreds of lives. Maybe, Jimmy said. Hard to say for sure. His father, walking on his other side, was quiet for a moment. Then, was it worth it, son? What you had to do? Jimmy thought about that question, really thought about it. Was it worth it? The fear, the loss, the weight of all those deaths? Yeah, he said finally. It was. Because the alternative was worse. Because someone had to do it. Because what we did mattered. The world's a better place because we won. His father nodded. That's all any of us can ask for, I suppose. To do something that matters. Jimmy Howard never spoke much about the war after that. He went to college on the GI Bill, got a degree in engineering, married a girl named Sarah who'd worked at an aircraft factory during the war. They had 3 children, lived in a modest house in the suburbs, lived quiet, ordinary lives. But once a year, every year on March 18th, Jimmy would take out his old flight jacket, the leather one with the flag patch and the 356th Fighter Squadron insignia, and wear it for the day. He never explained why to his children, not until they were grown. When his oldest daughter finally asked, he told her about Stendhal, about the dive through the clouds, about the fuel trucks and the explosions and the desperate glide to the Dutch farmer's field. I think about those German pilots sometimes, he said. The ones who died that morning. They were just doing their jobs, same as me. They probably had families, sweethearts, dreams. They probably wanted to survive the war and go home, just like I did. Do you regret it? His daughter asked. No, Jimmy said. But I remember it. That's important. You should remember the cost of what you do, even when it's necessary. Especially when it's necessary. Did you ever find out how many lives you saved? No. No way to know for sure. Those fighters might have shot down 10 bombers. Might have shot down 30. Might have missed entirely. He shrugged. But I knew some of those bomber crews. Good men. Friends. And they came home. Whatever I did, however many lives it cost or saved, at least my friends came home. That's what you think about on March 18th? Yeah, Jimmy said. That's what I think about. James Jimmy Howard died in 1995, at the age of 74. His obituary in the local paper was brief, mentioned his service in World War II, his career as an engineer, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. It didn't mention Stendhal. Most people had forgotten about it by then, lost in the enormous tide of World War II history. But the bomber crews remembered. Every year on March 18th, a few old men would raise a glass in quiet bars and VFW halls across America, and they'd toast the crazy fighter pilot who'd decided that his friends were worth dying for. And because he'd been willing to die for them, they'd lived.